Stop right there, criminal scum! Nobody breaks the law on my watch! I'm confiscating your stolen goods. Now pay your fine, or it's off to jail.
The JRPG genre, or the Japanese role-playing game. Never before have these games truly become mainstream, but I think we have now reached a point where JRPGs can get just as much excitement as Western RPGs, or WRPGs. We have seen an explosion in popularity from franchises like Fire Emblem and Persona, to name just a few. As a huge fan of story-driven games, I am happy with this. Not only has the stigma of anime games being weird started to disappear, mostly, but the wider appeal of JRPGs also allows Japanese developers to invest and innovate more. We're seeing JRPGs integrate modern design philosophies, and in some cases even become industry leaders. Just look at the games that never would have been localized before, like the new Sakura Wars game, to see the validation of the fact that the Western market matters and that Japan is changing. It wasn't always like this. Until surprisingly recently ago, the JRPG was a niche market and genre, and within that niche market only a few games really broke through into the mainstream. Chief among these was Final Fantasy. Especially with the release of Final Fantasy VII on the original PlayStation in 1997, the popularity of the franchise blew up. Frankly, at the time, there was nothing quite like it. Final Fantasy VII was for many people the first JRPG with 3D rendered characters. This was revolutionary at the time and had the imagination of a lot of kids, now adults, go overdrive. The compelling characters, mature themes and gripping story pushed the gaming medium forward for so many people who had never experienced anything like it. It wouldn't be a lie to say that Final Fantasy VII is the reason that many people became gamers at all. I was one of those kids who got his first PlayStation in the 90s and enjoyed timeless classics. So how did I like Final Fantasy VII? Well, it's kind of hard to remember, to be honest. I played and enjoyed the original FF7 off and on, and I had a lot of fun. But at the time the mechanics were too complicated for a young me, and additionally I really hated reading. So the walls of text that were trying to convey a compelling story didn't land all that well for me. Additionally, the at times troublesome localization also didn't help. Nonetheless, when shit went down I was hooked and sat on the corner of my seat until the walls of text made my eyelids fall shut. To this day I have fond memories of this game. I am just not one of those hardcore fans that loves Final Fantasy VII with a hugely unending burning passion. I think it is important to establish this, because my history with Final Fantasy VII influences my expectation of the remake. While scanning the internets, I found many people who really seemed to expect a perfect conversion of the original game to PlayStation 4, and in that aspect I differed. Nostalgia didn't set my expectations, and as such I didn't go into this remake expecting a one-to-one conversion. Square had been clearly communicating outwardly that they tried to make changes to have the remake meet modern quality standards, and to me, I was excited to see where this would lead. It was a chance to fix issues the original game had that we often ignore or forget about due to its legacy and age respectively. For some gamers, hearing the word changes was already detrimental, but I was curious to see how Square would address some of the glaring issues that the original Final Fantasy VII had. Translation, characters, recreating the pre-rendered backgrounds in real time. There were so many questions I wanted to see answered. Now, some 60 hours into the game later, having gotten all summons, music, playing most of hard mode and so on, let's discuss just how good or bad these changes were. Did Square Enix manage to make this Final Fantasy VII a true and timeless classic, or did the charming party run out of MP? Let's find out. Before anything, let me say this. If you're new to Final Fantasy since this generation, then do not expect this game to be like Final Fantasy XV. I will go into more depth comparing the two throughout this review, but for now it's most important to establish the following. This is a story-driven game from start to end. There are semi-open areas, but generally speaking this is a linear experience. I would even go as far as saying that it has some striking similarities to Final Fantasy XIII, essentially being a set of hallways bringing you from A to B. This is, of course, opposite to the open world that characterizes Final Fantasy XV. I see this move in design philosophy as a good thing. While it doesn't make Midgar as explorable as we perhaps imagined during the reveal trailer, it does hugely benefit the pacing of the game. In fact, I believe that the open world nature of Final Fantasy XV is a huge part of why the overall experience felt inconsistent. Being free to do whatever you want removed the urgency from its narrative and limited mission designs. Just imagine what Square could have done if all the time creating that open world had been spent on smaller hubs and a more cohesive story. Whether it was out of respect to the original product or because Square stopped caring about the backlash against linear games, you can expect this game to have better pacing due to its linear nature. Alright, onto the review proper. Let's talk story. If you were to ask me to describe Final Fantasy VII Remake in one sentence, I would have summarized it as realized nostalgia with a twist. I think this sentence best encapsulates just what you will experience in the Final Fantasy VII Remake package. It's everything you remember from the original game and more, but at the same time it is also different. Sometimes subtly so, and sometimes glaringly so. The first thing I noticed when playing Final Fantasy VII Remake is its characters, specifically the added depth. This is the greatest victory of the game. Square Enix grabbed the first 4 to 6 hours of the original FF7 and rewrote everything. Dialogue, interactions, some of the event placements, and added an amount of depth that we've frankly never seen before in any other remake. Characters like Cloud, Tifa, Barret, and Avalanche as a whole are now set up far better than the original ever did, and a big part of that is due to dialogue. I watched some of the developer episodes on IGN, and one of the things explicitly noted by the people who headed Final Fantasy VII Remake was that they wanted to rewrite all of the dialogue. The original game told its story decently well, but it was told at the player, not from character to character. It also suffered from some stereotypes that sorely lacked nuance. It's not hard to see that Barret in the original FF7 was essentially Mr. T. Square set the goal to make all characters believable by rewriting every line of dialogue to fit character-to-character interaction and adding a whole heap of new events to boot. There are some changes in the remake story that are questionable, as I will cover later, but when it comes to characterizing Avalanche, the Turks, and even Shinra to some extent, the remake knocked it out of the park. More than any other Square Enix game since the PlayStation 2 era, this game exudes charm.
So then, what is this ragtag group of misfits I see before me? Avalanche!
Local florist.
Lab rat dog.
Some of it the remake has to thank the original for, but plenty of it was added just to the remake. Just look at Jessie for one of the easiest examples of correct changes made by Square Enix that truly enhanced the original experience. An entire chapter was dedicated to her backstory, her wishes for the future, and your relationship with her as the player. I cared and genuinely thought of what choice to make when Jessie asked me to come over to her place, even though I knew what her eventual fate would be. She went from being an unknown to now being compared to Tifa and Aerith. Considering the legacy of those girls, this is a big deal. Avalanche as a whole was kinda flat in the original, but in the remake, Jessie, Biggs, and Wedge matter. All of them have highlights in the story and are very likable. These meaningful changes even extend into gameplay, with a funny example being Wedge distracting dogs for Cloud, using his ass as bait. Similar meaningful upgrades have also happened to other characters, which makes the tragic parts of the story all the more tragic. The whole game is filled with context-sensitive dialogue and important scenes that you can miss due to not exploring or not meeting certain requirements. Yes, doing the side quests does matter, even though their mission design can leave something to be desired.
I feel no fear. Yeah, no fear. No fear. No fear. No fear. Ooh, no fear. Little fear.
All of these little details help round off the characters and to make the game narrative as a whole feel more complete. They add heaps of quality to a product that very few other games can compare to. Square Enix really did care to get this remake right. Aside from script, another part of what made these characters so much better realized in the remake is the voice delivery. As far as I'm concerned, the English voices in the remake are as good as the Japanese dub, maybe even a tad better. This because I feel some of the English cast fit the character designs better. Bear just doesn't quite look correct in Japanese.
Made it through in one piece.
Think that took a couple years off my life. Not really. Couple seconds maybe. 3 tops.
For the most part, the new cast outshines the Advent Children and Crisis Core cast. This is the Tifa, Aerith, Cloud, Biggs, Rufus and so on I wanted to hear for many years to come. Not all characters are a smash hit, as I'll once again cover later, but generally here too Square did right. It cannot be understated just how important these victories are. This game is carried by its story. While Final Fantasy as a franchise has often had great stories, they also often had mediocre translations and inconsistent delivery. I'm sure at least a few of you thought of Tidus laughing in Final Fantasy X. But I don't mean this scene, as that laugh was weird on purpose. No, I mean that Final Fantasy games have suffered from inconsistent voice delivery and mediocre scripts from Final Fantasy X until as recently as Final Fantasy XV.
And I'm sick of your endless whining. Calm the hell down. Get off my back.
This was okay in the PlayStation 2 era, sure, but standards have been raised immensely since then, so the weird delivery in modern Final Fantasy games started to become more noticeable. Don't get me wrong, generally the English voices are fine in older Final Fantasy games, but when it got really weird, and made the dialogue very jarring. And this in turn reminded me that I was playing a game. Real people wouldn't talk like that. The immersion got broken, and that hurts a product that tries to realize a fantasy. This issue is essentially remedied as a whole in Final Fantasy VII Remake.
Well, seems this old friend of mine's in a tight spot. Long time ago I said I'd be there for her. Made a promise. So...
Can't say this is quite what I had in mind when I put that on you way back when.
All characters have a voice that fit, and the actors deliver the lines with proper pronunciation, enunciation and emotion. Moments that are meant to be funny are, and serious moments feel important. This is a quality of delivery that many JRPGs aren't even remotely close to, all animated to fit the lips near perfectly in both English and Japanese. I think it is fair to say that Final Fantasy VII Remake is one of the best English dubs of a JRPG to date, though it still has a few rough moments.
She's so cute!
Hey! What the hell do you think you're doing scaring my daughter like that?
Well, I didn't do anything!
Another character that has been well realized is the world itself. It is tough to make different regions of a world feel distinct when literally everything is steampunk, but somehow Square managed to do it. All slums have a different character, and the difference between the slums and the plates where the Shinra people live have been visually and artistically realized better than anywhere else. This includes Advent Children and Crisis Core, by the way. For many who played the original, we could only wonder what the sky looked like from the slums because the camera was static. We had to rely on descriptions, rare cutscenes and other games, but in Final Fantasy VII Remake you get to explore the mostly linear world at your pace, and it is glorious. I say mostly linear because the game has various locales where you can perform side quests. These hubs bring life to Midgar. Throughout these hubs you will find that nearly every single NPC has unique dialogue. Many of these lines aren't just throwaway lines either. They all explain tiny bits and pieces about the world of Midgar, and it makes these slums, plates and markets feel alive. Not just that, but after every event in the game, their dialogue changes too. I can't even begin to imagine the sheer amount of voice lines recorded. In particular, I want to praise Wall Market. Whereas in the original game, the Wall Market was rather small scale and almost seemed inspired by a carnival at times, due to its colors and a more rural feel, the Wall Market has been completely rebuilt in the remake to be a full-on city. It is filled to the brim with interesting characters, fun minigames, and small details that make Final Fantasy VII Remake something truly special. Especially the Wall Market trio stands out due to their colorful personalities and the interesting dynamics they have with the market and one another. My personal favorite is Andrea Rodea. It is rare to see a game handle a flamboyant character this well. Andrea is weird in all the right ways, and he also steals every single scene he is in when he is serious. Overall, when it comes to characters, story presentation and being visually appealing, Midgar steals the show. But not all changes are a victory. I will not go too deep into spoilers immediately, but I suggest skipping ahead if you really want to avoid more details. Alright, let's cover some changes that aren't necessarily bad, but that do leave me a tad worried, or perhaps cautiously optimistic is the best way to describe them. As shown in trailers, new Dementor-looking foes have been added to the game. These Whisperers of Fate were not in the original FF7 or its expanded universe as far as I'm aware. In Final Fantasy VII Remake, their role is to preserve destiny at all costs. Conceptually, I think they are interesting, and I also believe that big changes are needed to flesh out the remainder of Final Fantasy VII. But what does it mean to protect or preserve destiny? What these Whisperers end up doing in the game is preserving the story of the original PlayStation 1 game, whenever the story walks the line of deviating. This is interesting as these Whisperers essentially embody the wishes of purists who played the original and want that game recreated one-to-one. In concept, this is a neat bit of writing that at times gets close to a fourth wall-breaking character, however in practice the execution was sloppy. Final Fantasy VII Remake is about 30 to 40 hours long if you want to have a fairly complete experience, and it is over 100 GB large. Square Enix chose to only remake Midgar at first because this prevents them from having to remake the open world of the original game that the player entered after leaving Midgar. However, in the original game, the escape from Midgar wasn't a rounded narrative. It wasn't a complete story yet, just the end of the opening. So Square somehow had to make Midgar alone a satisfying story with a start, middle and proper end. The Whisperers were introduced to give the game a complete narrative, where the result of defying fate, i.e. changing the story of the original game, comes to a head at the end of the remake. The problem is that for a vast majority of the game, the Whisperers aren't explained at all. Sometimes they help you, sometimes they attack you. But never do they speak or communicate with you at all. This is understandable in the sense that they are a response from the planet to keep destiny in place. But this also means that the Whisperers need to rely on exposition from other characters to become a compelling entity or antagonist. The game did not succeed at this. To be entirely frank, the game did not do a good job of explaining what maintaining destiny means whatsoever. Nothing is explained to hint at why they intervene at specific moments either. Only people who played the original game might notice that the Whisperers intervene during events that change from the original game and so forth. For most people, the inclusion and relevance of these Whisperers will be questionable at best. To say it very bluntly, protecting the story of the original game doesn't give the Whisperers character. There is nobody in the remake who can explain that these Whisperers are protecting the original story. How could they? As this kind of fourth wall breaking moment doesn't happen in Final Fantasy. And so, the motivation of the Whisperers are never clear. I think Square Enix knew that the Whisperers as a whole lacked depth, and so they tried to add another layer to the finale of the game with another main villain. Which brings me to the next questionable change I hinted at earlier. Sephiroth.
Run, Cloud. Run away. You have to leave. You have to live.
For the few among you who watched this video without having played the original game, Sephiroth was barely in the Midgar section. Nearly all encounters with him are new, and every single encounter that was in the original has at least been changed to feature more of Sephiroth. Let me start off by saying that I do not think that Square ruined Sephiroth. I think that if Remake Part 2 is handled with care, Sephiroth can be as iconic as he ever was. Although some voice lines are delivered questionably, he still works most of the time. His charm is mostly intact, and he is as intimidating and powerful as ever. But when playing the game, you can feel that things don't entirely line up. You see, Sephiroth is meant to really only become relevant after the Midgar section, where the party resolves to find him, learn about him, and eventually stop him. His master plan isn't that relevant to Midgar, and this is still true in the remake as well. You certainly see Sephiroth a lot more, but for a vast majority of the game his appearances don't make an impact whatsoever. Certainly, a few flashbacks add to the mystery of Cloud's backstory and why he has headaches. But that could be done in just that, a few flashbacks. Instead, the game features a lot more than just a few flashbacks of Sephiroth. Especially near the end of the game, Sephiroth makes more appearances where he starts to change the course of the original game more and more until eventually you get your first true encounter with him as the final boss. Visually and gameplay-wise, this boss fight is spectacular. It is Advent Children made playable, and I applaud Square for their work, but narratively this fight feels out of place. This is logical, after all, it was never in the original. The point of this fight in the remake is to show the player just how powerful Sephiroth is, a bit more of his relationship to Cloud, and that by beating the Whisperers, you give him the room needed to start enacting his plan. You freed him from fate by beating the Whisperers, and now he is free to do as he wishes, and you can't stop him. As an idea to expand on Sephiroth, and that you are partially responsible for everything that is to come in Part 2, this is amazing. But in practice, new players would know as little about Sephiroth now as they do the Whisperers. Maybe even less, since the motivation of Sephiroth hasn't been covered at all. We don't know who he is, where he is from, and what he wants to do. There is no hint about why Cloud fears him yet either, just the one throwaway line at the start of the game where Cloud says he killed Sephiroth with his own hands. In other words, the end of Final Fantasy VII Remake consists of you fighting two underdeveloped characters in a row as a final boss. This is underwhelming narratively and inconsistent with the high quality writing found in most chapters up to that point. It makes the ending quite jarring for new players, and for players of the original it creates fear. Suddenly Sephiroth can now change fate, so does that change the story as a whole from now on? It is very understandable that many players would come to dislike the ending of the remake for this reason. Still, I think that Square has shown that they know what they are doing. Considering the changes made to Avalanche, Wall Market and even Shinra, I think we should give Square the benefit of the doubt here. Whether you like or dislike the ending of this remake, it is fair to say that the next part of this remake will be the make or break point. Everything now rides on Square Enix delivering a modern take on the remainder of Final Fantasy VII, whilst also giving a satisfying conclusion to the new plot threads introduced in this remake. As I said before, I am cautiously optimistic. Alright, enough about story, let's talk graphics. For the Final Fantasy VII Remake, Square said they wanted to make the game look as good as Advent Children. It has now been 15 years since Advent Children released, which makes me realize just how old I've become, and since then real-time graphics have come a long way. You've been looking at footage in the background this entire time, and I think it speaks for itself. Most of the time Final Fantasy VII Remake looks as good or even better than Advent Children, especially the character models. Like I mentioned before, the world generally looks gorgeous, with plenty of character in every region. Some places look like giant junkyards, whereas others are inspired by neon signs you'd find in 90s Japan and old Eastern architecture. This is contrasted with the pure steampunk industrial environment of the reactors, which also differ from the futuristic look found in the Shinra building. Everything is distinct, and it, combined with the beautiful characters and crisp animations, makes this the best looking Square Enix game to date. But again, much like the story, it isn't all good news. Due to development issues with Final Fantasy XV, Square Enix decided to move away from their own in-house engine to Unreal Engine 4, first with Kingdom Hearts 3 and now with Final Fantasy VII Remake. This brought with it a lot of good things I just mentioned, but it also brought some Unreal issues with it. Unreal Engine has, since the PlayStation 3 generation, been notorious for texture pop-in, and this too strikes in the remake. Whilst you won't notice it too much if you take it easy and explore around, the loading in of world detail becomes extremely apparent once you start running around carelessly. Additionally, some places also have extremely muddy textures. Let me be clear in saying this. Square did a standout job in creating innumerable different assets which are used in the game. It is a damn miracle how many different objects you can find with lavish detail. Every building, every sheet of metal that is used to make makeshift houses in the slums. Heck, almost every tire seems unique. But because of all of these different objects, some of which are very detail heavy, not all objects were treated equally. The result is that some objects look straight out of a PlayStation 2 game. Yeah, it is that bad. Some objects have lower resolution texturing than PlayStation 3 games. This would already stand out in a PlayStation 4 game in general, but when the rest of the remake looks this gorgeous, it only stands out more. The most notorious joke likely is Cloud's door to his room in the Sector 7 slums. They look like doors straight out of GTA Liberty City on the PlayStation 2. Why this door and the ones next to it are so badly textured when they are right in the player's face, nobody knows, but it does make the visual presentation feel inconsistent. It really puts a black mark on this otherwise perfectly white sheet of paper. This is a big shame because Final Fantasy XV did not suffer from this. It had a high quality, pristine look throughout, and this causes Final Fantasy VII Remake to feel like a downgrade at times, when really it isn't. Let me put it this way, generally speaking, Final Fantasy VII Remake is gorgeous, the best work done by Square Enix, but it has more visual inconsistencies than any other Final Fantasy before it. Additionally, Midgar is a dirty world. You will mostly see slums, and so there are relatively few moments where the player gets to interact with pristine environments that are created purely to please the eyes. Trash just doesn't look as appealing as marble. Personally, I do not think that anything in Final Fantasy VII Remake beats the sheer beauty found in Alticia in Final Fantasy XV. This is one of the difficulties of remaking a game, rather than being completely free creatively with a new game entry. You have to follow the original art. Don't let that deter you, however. Overall, Final Fantasy VII Remake is a visual spectacle, one that has a far more lively world than Final Fantasy XV ever did in spite of its open world. Next, I want to cover gameplay and level design. I kept these for last because the gameplay footage will have done much of the talking for me. Unlike the original, Final Fantasy VII Remake opted to go full-on real-time combat. I've seen people call the remake an evolution of the gambit system in Final Fantasy XII, but I disagree. I think the combat system sits comfortably in the middle of the real-time action found in Final Fantasy XV, with the MP and ATB skills of the original game, whilst also taking NPC commands from Final Fantasy XII's gambits. In other words, it takes inspiration from modern Final Fantasy as a whole and infuses it with the spirit of the original game, and I'll be damned if they didn't nail it. Final Fantasy VII Remake feels great to play. Every hit has the right amount of weight, animations are smooth, the balance of the game is strong, and every character you control feels different. While playing Cloud, you may even get some flashes of Devil May Cry, even though the combat isn't similar whatsoever, simply because the attacks animate and feel like they could be in DMC. So then why do I disagree with the comparisons to Final Fantasy XII, when I also just mentioned it myself? There is a difference in philosophy between Final Fantasy XII, XV, and this remake. You see, in Final Fantasy XII and XV, the goal was always to build your party in such a way that you only ever needed to control your one character. In Final Fantasy XII, you built detailed commands via gambits to make sure that you barely ever needed to use an item or take command of your other party members. You could, but why would you? The same applies to Final Fantasy XV. After the Royal Edition patch and the character DLCs, you could take direct control of your homeboys, but you didn't ever need to. The game wasn't built for it. Final Fantasy VII Remake is the complete opposite. It expects you to take control of all characters and use them to their full extent. Frankly, even on normal mode, I think you'll have a hard time even beating the game if you only ever bother to control Cloud and ignore your other party members. Maybe if you grind away hours to overlevel you can, but I think you're missing the point of the game's combat system if you do. The game gives you 4 characters to build as you wish, and while every one of them definitely leans more towards certain roles, Aerith being the healer and caster, Barret the tank, Tifa the melee damage dealer, and Cloud the all-rounder, you can still give them all completely unique builds. All characters have a decent selection of weapons, all with different strengths, weaknesses and abilities, which helps give the gameplay more body and depth. The remake took over the materia system from the original game wholesale, which allows you to freely place skills and spells on any character, which can be used once their ATB meter reaches at least 1 full bar. No character can have all skills or all spells, so you are organically pushed towards building the characters so they cover each other's strengths and weaknesses. Now, the risk of this is that it would only work if every character felt fun to play, so once again, Square should be applauded for managing to do just that. Using Cloud as a lead man feels natural and mixes well with Tifa for quick and powerful hits. Meanwhile, switching to Barret or Aerith for flying foes also feels great. I do feel like Aerith is the least fun to play, because her Tempest doesn't add a lot of depth or variety. But overall, Square once again succeeded with flying colors. To provide a bit of context on why Aerith is the most boring character to play. Every character has a main attack and an alternate attack. You can also hold the main button down with most characters to get a different result. Cloud will do different sword attacks, for example. This dynamic of pressing your main or alternate attack or holding down the buttons provides depth to all characters. But Aerith doesn't change in gameplay very much. Cloud's operator stance allows him to deal way more damage and also allows for parries, which stun foes. Meanwhile, Tifa, her alternate attack will deal massive burst damage or also launch foes. Barret is good for range and has an interesting cooldown mechanic on his alternate attack. Plus, his natural role as a tank gives him plenty of depth. Meanwhile, for Aerith, she gets Tempest. Tempest just kind of hangs there and then explodes. It deals good damage, great damage even, but in practice you either hold down square or triangle, and that's it. The slow swings of her staff also feel the least impactful of the entire cast. Do not misunderstand this as her being useless. Aerith is essential. Her ward that allows you to cast spells twice is amazing, but she just doesn't feel as good to play as the others. Moving on, the game is also full of optional combat challenges which give you useful rewards, and intel challenges which let you capture new summons. You do not take direct control of the summons, but when you use them during tough battles, you can spend your ATB to have them use specific skills which may sway the battle in your favor. Some of these summon battles are tough and require a decent amount of work to even unlock. I would be surprised if anyone unlocked all summons during their first playthrough, and that is a good thing. This game has legs. Speaking of having legs, Final Fantasy VII Remake features a New Game Plus hard mode, which unlocks after beating the game your first time, and this edition adds a lot of longevity. In hard mode, you bring the standard items and levels with you, of course, but the hard mode goes a step further, by making every usable item, such as potions or reviving Phoenix Downs, entirely unavailable. Not just that, but your magic points also do not recover, so you cannot spam magic to victory. In addition to that, all enemies also deal a lot more damage and have a lot more health too. Some bosses also change to have new phases and different weaknesses. This is a fleshed out and well designed New Game Plus. All of these changes and restrictions may make hard mode seem unreasonable, and yet you can still make your way through hard mode provided you learn the combat system. I think this perfectly exemplifies just how good and deep the combat in Final Fantasy VII Remake is. I struggled a few times on normal mode against a few bosses and mob groups, but items and resting benches to refill my MP got me through just fine. Yet, after playing hard mode, you get to understand the character moves, strengths, and materia benefits so well that normal bosses become a breeze. There is a learning curve to the gameplay here, which really does allow for mastery, and that mastery makes a notable impact. This makes the game feel very rewarding to play. Considering the growth of the cast for Part 2, I'm not sure if Square Enix is considering swappable party members, But whatever they do, I hope they manage to maintain the balance and depth sweet spot that they hit here. Beyond that, the game also performs really well. In my entire playtime, including all I did in New Game Plus hard mode, I only ever encountered one single notable frame drop. This is a huge improvement over the inconsistent frame pacing found in Final Fantasy XV. Square put playability as a top priority, and it is noticeable. You are bound to have a responsive, dynamic and fun experience whether you play on base PS4 or PS4 Pro. Finally, I want to talk about level design before we conclude this video. As mentioned before, this game is linear. Most of the time this works in favor of the game. The story benefits pacing-wise, as I've covered, and gameplay-wise the game benefits too. You see, the struggle of open-world games is that the player can come from any angle and do so many different things, which makes it very difficult to design a proper mission. It is for this reason that games like Grand Theft Auto like to put you inside smaller environments and on rails during missions. That way the developers can control what the player sees and when he sees it. It is essential to do this in order to make missions appealing. A great example of what happens when missions do take place in an open world with no restrictions is the campaign of Vanilla Destiny. It is filled with missions in the open world that you've probably already explored with very little interaction or depth. The same issue also applies to a lesser extent to Final Fantasy XV. Missions in the open world were often simple in nature and with very few moments that impacted the world. Because the player can go everywhere, they also cannot be directed through properly scripted events and so on. There were certainly moments where Square tried, but they often felt clunky, such as stealth missions that lacked proper stealth gameplay mechanics. The game immediately switched over to linear levels when the story had to be told with more care and direction. This only caused open world fans to feel restricted, and meanwhile linear story fans felt like the game under-delivered on its story. It is for this reason that I can thankfully say that Final Fantasy VII Remake stayed true to its roots, remaining a linear adventure full of scripted moments as Final Fantasy has traditionally always been. Final Fantasy has always been good at giving the illusion of freedom via its overworld, but the moment you enter a location, the mission was linear. Choice in exploration was usually just optional stuff, and Final Fantasy VII Remake is no different. Throughout the game, you will constantly be led to new environments, sometimes by opening doors that were locked before, sometimes after story progression opens a new mission with a cutscene. The game clearly marks where you should progress to, and this allows Square to include plenty scripted cinematic moments where your party splits up or intimidating bosses are introduced to mess you up. Everything feels more directed and of a very high quality. You won't get lost, but you will be engaged. The few explorable paths that are available are clearly marked on the minimap, and this helps you get the complete playthrough if you wish. This does bring me to my last negative, however, and one that has been addressed by some other reviewers in detail as well. Padding. The growth from 4 to 6 hours of Midgar in the original to 30 hours in the remake isn't all thanks to new content. Sadly, part of it is also missions that have a few too many long hallways for the player to run through and do very little else in. Most egregious are certain chapters in which you travel a railway tunnel, the second reactor mission and a collapsed highway. All of these missions overextend their welcome with overly long straight corridors and repetitive gimmicks, the worst of which is a puzzle where you have to move Aerith around via slow, clunky robot hands 3 different times. These puzzles barely got harder and never got interesting. Moments like these end up making the map feel cohesive when it completely opens up near the end of the game, yeah, but they aren't fun to play. Final Fantasy VII Remake could have easily been a 20 to 30 hour experience completed and be better for it. Still, a notable improvement overall it is. Honestly, I had been longing for a properly paced, directed story experience, and this game does deliver. Nearly every corner brings something new and exciting. Every now and then when the story takes a break, the player gets to do so too, via the hubs with side quests, and then on to the next linear part you go. This is where storytelling in games is at its very best. And so we get to the conclusion. With this, I've covered all of my thoughts on the game in detail. Final Fantasy VII Remake is a great game, and a great remake too. It succeeds in story, gameplay, visually, and design-wise, making it the best Final Fantasy of the HD era. That is to say, Final Fantasy XIII until this game. The game still has issues that hold it back from being perfect. Side quests are more often than not bland, the visuals have inconsistencies, and some story choices are definitely cause for concern. But for now, as it stands as a solo product, Final Fantasy VII Remake succeeds. It thrives on delivering a compelling story with awesome characters and the best real-time gameplay Square Enix has created for Final Fantasy ever. If you are into fantasy games with dark themes and a steampunk aesthetic, I can almost guarantee you will have a good time with this game. Midgar's streets, slums, fantastic bosses, rich detail and volume of content is worth exploring and experiencing. I will certainly go back for more hard mode content and perhaps some DLC. And I am absolutely there for the remainder of the ride in part 2 or 3 whenever they may release. Though we don't know if the whole story will deliver, at least this first piece, Cloud and Midgar, have proven to be timeless. Thank you for watching. Please don't forget to comment and subscribe, and hopefully until the next video soon.